The sea is cold. They say the sea is cold, but the sea contains the hottest blood of all. D.H. Lawrence. I am a passionate man. I've been called mad, one-eyed, a daft old bugger and told to get a life. I can see their point. My passion is whales, and the damn Japanese are at it again, using the lofty mystique of the word research to justify the wholesale slaughter of these gentle giants, whose only sin is being built to enormous proportions that contain a huge amount of fat and protein. The last time the Japanese played this game, I joined up with Greenpeace as a whale expert. We shadowed the Japanese ship for weeks until they found a pod just cruising along, singing their songs, eating their krill and being a family. There were 7 and we could identify each of them by the patterns on their tails, each as individual as fingerprints on us. I named them. Henry was the lead bull. His 3 ladies I called Elizabeth, Mary and Anne, and the 2 male children were William and Harry. The little female, who seemed to belong to Anne, I called Diana. It came time to launch the Naiads from our mothership. Naiads are very fast and nippy. I climbed into one with 3 others and we set off to stop these maniacs from killing beautiful, defenceless creatures. Why slaughter marine, air-breathing, live-bearing mammals that appreciate music and communication and form groups for company? The spray was icy cold on my face as we screamed across the surface. We were headed to a position in front of their bow, between their killing machine and the whales, hopefully allowing the whales to escape. The sea and the sky were bleak, and a sort of pewter colour that made the horizon difficult to read. The gulls, which had miraculously appeared, wheeled and screamed at the thought of food. Not if I can help it, I thought. As we pulled alongside, our skipper raised his bullhorn and gave out our pre-arranged message. World opinion from the majority of countries and the International Whaling Commission. The message was, stop killing whales and go home. All the research information you could possibly want is already in the archives, and any further data could easily be gathered without killing the animals you came to study. At this point, the Japanese sailors, who had appeared to be listening, formed into pairs and lifted high-pressure water hoses, which they turned on us. The cold was paralysing and the force of the water almost sunk us. Our skipper must have had lightning reflexes because, while I was still trying to absorb the shock of the initial cold, he had wheeled the Naiad 90 degrees away from the mothership and we were quickly out of range. "Everyone okay?" he asked. There were murmurs of "bastards," sailors doing this to other sailors, and on the high seas, and "God, I'm cold." With my nature, I seemed to be the only one really concerned about my own well-being. "What about using a grenade launcher?" asked Brian, an ex-Navy coxswain. "We'll not be using violence in any shape or form, otherwise we would in effect be joining their ranks and giving validation to their actions. Thomas, I hope you're noting all of this in your little memory bank for a full report," said the skipper. "Aye, sir," I said. "So what now?" Now, having tried diplomacy and received an inappropriate response, to wit, a Japanese raspberry, we do what we came to do, and that's to run interference. The harpoonist and his offsider were clearly visible on the prow of their vessel, checking their equipment. They both turned to watch us speeding to our position, and I suppose their gesture to us is universal, certainly amongst men. We found the pod and watched their movement. We followed them, slightly closer than we were to the Japanese ship. I could feel as much as see the tension in this little pod. Their breathing rate was faster than normal and Henry had changed course. I heard a boom behind me, then the scream of a rope. Henry's changed direction had taken him just far enough away from our direct line that the harpoonist took the shot. There was an explosion of sound, blood and spray as the harpoon hit home. Henry had been mortally wounded and the mothership had started to turn and open the huge doors to pull Henry in. I could see him flapping as though he was trying to swim away, but the thick rope started to drag him through the water. He was so big that I believe the ship actually moved toward him at the same time. I looked back and saw Elizabeth, Mary and Anne begin to panic, swimming in circles and upsetting their calves. I also saw the harpoonist starting to reload. "Henry's gone!" I shouted. "But we must protect the others." "You're right," yelled the skipper over the din. "But I've got a bad feeling about this. That harpoonist is damn good." I turned and saw a sight which was the most sorrowful any cetacean lover could ever witness. Henry was being dragged up the deck slope. Blood was gushing from his harpoon wound, his mouth and his blowhole. He was still alive, but barely, and I fervently hoped that the endorphins that mammals have were working their magic, and that the end would come soon. I had tears in my eyes as I searched for the remaining cows and calves. They were milling about in panic, and I saw that Elizabeth had put herself between us and the pod so that she became their first line of defence, with us as a backup. "Clever girl," I said to no one in particular, "but stay close." Diana, the little one, by now thoroughly confused and frightened, darted away at right angles to the line of the ship. Elizabeth took off after her, and our skipper made his only mistake. He chased after Elizabeth and Diana, leaving the rest of the pod without a defence. Sickeningly, I heard one explosion after another. I turned to see Mary and Anne and one of the boys in a melee of blood and guts, a seething turmoil of fins and spray, of thrashing and despair. We stayed with Elizabeth and watched in horror as the others were dragged towards the sloping deck. "Get me over there," I shouted. "What are you going to do?" asked the skipper. "I don't know, but I'm not staying here to watch this, not when I could be doing something. Bloody get me over there, now!" "Okay," said the skipper, "but I don't know what you can do. Just don't get hurt yourself." The Naiad charged towards the sloping deck. When we got near, the skipper throttled back. "Closer!" I yelled. He edged forward and I leapt out onto the deck. "Permission to come aboard," I shouted in parody. I ran over to Anne. She was being slowly pulled up the deck, spilling blood. I put my hands near her eye and looked into it, stroking the surrounding skin. "I am so sorry," I said. "If only we had more boats. We may have been able to stop this. I am so sorry." Something moved in her eye. A change. A momentary flash. Something that for the rest of my life I would always wonder about. But it was there. "So, who's an anthropomorphic old fool then?" I asked myself. There was a shout from the skipper and I looked up to see two of the Japanese butchers coming down the deck slope towards me. I thought, well, this will slow them down a bit and maybe allow Elizabeth, William and Diana to escape the slaughter ship. The two approaching men held their flensing knives in an aggressive way and smiled. The knives looked like huge, sharp ice hockey sticks that were capable of beheading me. They came to within 3 metres of me when Anne twitched. It was a spasm, a shudder perhaps, but her tail slapped sideways and cut the feet from under both men, who then started to slide down the blood-soaked sloping deck, straight off the edge, into the icy sea and under. The edge of the deck was pitching and splashing heavily with the wave motion. I looked over and saw only the sea. Just then, a hand appeared and I grabbed it and heaved. Out of the freezing waters came one of the Japanese. He was still holding his flensing knife. I made sure he had a stable footing. Then I put my hand out for the knife. He looked at me, shivering but curious. But because he was a deckhand, he looked up for orders. "No!" I shouted at him to get his attention. "Look at me! Look at me!" He did, and there was a silent but very clear message of apology and thanks in his now not so inscrutable eyes. He nodded his head and said, "Hi." The flensing knife was put into my hand, just as another shout came from our boat. "Thomas, look!" shouted the skipper, pointing. The other deckhand was spluttering and gasping on the surface. I reached down and hauled him onto the deck near his mate. They embraced. As one, they turned and looked at me. I hoisted the big flensing knife in front of me, then turned and threw it safely into the cold grey waters. I followed it with a gesture of good riddance, and the three of us all laughed. In turn, as though choreographed, they clasped their hands as though in prayer and bowed to me deeply. This was such an unexpected outcome that my poor, cold and battered brain was not keeping up, or so I thought, until I bowed back in a manner that would have pleased Pepys, Johnson and Boswell, an exaggerated and extravagant bow. Why had I done that? I had absolutely no idea. Later, I realised that if I had copied their bow, I would have put myself on their level, but my brain had worked out that I needed something different and preferably over the top. Well, you got it, mate. There was a cheer from the boat, which had edged up to the deck, and I climbed on board. As our skipper got us up to speed to return to our own ship, we all looked up at the Japanese bridge, and there, on the port side wing, was a stony-faced captain. Lots of gold braid and a still posture that could have meant anything. But to our utter amazement, he suddenly saluted us. It showed that his orders were quite explicit about the whaling, but underneath the rigid exterior was a warrior acknowledging another warrior. One tiny little gesture in the middle of a mighty ocean was like a ray of sunlight in a cathedral. As one, we turned to look at the killing field, and were just in time to see Elizabeth's tail disappearing into the deep. "Farewell, you three," I said silently. "Be safe, and we will keep on trying." "You do realise that we got everything on film?" asked the skipper. "What? Absolutely everything?" "Yes, but we have never, ever seen an unarmed man use a whale to disarm two dangerous opponents." "You're a hero, mate," said the skipper, thumping me on the back. "Not me," I said with a grin. "I'm just an old softy into whales, with a fine tale of a fine tale. But you know it was all a fluke."